Have you ever looked at a map of Africa and wondered why so many of its borders are straight lines? They look almost artificial, drawn with a ruler. Well, that's because they were, and the story behind those lines is not one of diplomacy or exploration, but of pure, unadulterated greed. It's the story of how a continent was stolen, its people divided, and its future rewritten by outsiders who saw it as nothing more than a prize to be won. This is the story of the Berlin Conference of 1884, but it's not the one you learned in school. Forget the sanitized version of explorers and civilizing missions. We're going to talk about what really happened. A feast where Europe was the guest of honor and Africa was the main course. To understand the sheer audacity of the Berlin Conference, we have to rewind a bit. By the late 19th century, Europe was in the full throes of the Industrial Revolution. Factories were churning out goods at an unprecedented rate, and nations were competing fiercely for economic and military dominance. What do you need to fuel such an engine? Raw materials. And what do you need to sell all those manufactured goods? New markets. Africa, with its vast, untapped wealth of rubber, diamonds, gold, copper, and fertile land, was the perfect target. It was a treasure chest just waiting to be unlocked. Before the 1880s, European presence in Africa was mostly limited to coastal trading posts. The interior of the continent, the so-called Dark Continent in the racist parlance of the time, remained largely under African control. But the competitive spirit of European nationalism was heating up. King Leopold II of Belgium had already laid a personal claim to the Congo, a region 76 times the size of his own country, under the guise of a humanitarian mission. He called it the Congo Free State, a name that could not have been more ironic, as it would soon become a site of unimaginable brutality. Other powers, like France and Portugal, were expanding their own claims, and Britain was eyeing a route from Cairo in the north to Cape Town in the south. The race was on. A chaotic and potentially violent scramble for territory was beginning. Faced with the prospect of European powers going to war with each other over African land, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck decided to step in. He wasn't particularly interested in colonies himself at first, but he was a master of political strategy. He saw an opportunity to manage the competition, solidify Germany's new position as a major European power, and avoid a costly conflict between the empires. So he called a meeting. In November 1884, representatives from 14 nations, 13 from Europe, plus the United States gathered in Berlin. Now, let's pause and consider who was at this conference. You had Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, Spain, all the major colonial players. Who wasn't there? Not a single African, not one king, not one queen, not one tribal elder, not one community representative. The fate of an entire continent home to hundreds of distinct cultures, kingdoms, and societies was being decided by a group of men in a European capital. Thousands of miles away, who knew next to nothing about the people whose lives they were about to tear apart. The official agenda of the Berlin Conference was to regulate trade and navigation on the Congo and Niger rivers, and to establish a set of rules for future colonization. They cloaked their intentions in the language of civilization and humanitarianism. They talked about ending the slave trade within Africa and bringing commerce and Christianity to its people. It sounded noble, didn't it? But this was just a smokescreen. The real purpose was to formalize the theft. The conference established a principle called effective occupation. This meant that a European power could claim a piece of Africa simply by planting their flag, establishing some form of administration, and notifying the other European signatories. Think about that for a second. Effective occupation. It completely disregarded the fact that these lands were already occupied. They were home to thriving societies, ancient kingdoms with rich histories, and complex political systems. The Asante Empire, the Zulu Kingdom, the Sokoto Caliphate, these were powerful, organized states. But in the eyes of the men in Berlin, they didn't count. Their sovereignty was irrelevant. The only effective occupation that mattered was European. So the carving began. With a map of Africa spread out on a table, they drew lines. They used rivers, mountains, and lines of latitude and longitude as convenient dividers, with no regard for the human geography on the ground. A single line could cut a thriving ethnic group in two, separating families and disrupting centuries-old trade routes. In other cases, rival groups who had been enemies for generations were suddenly lumped together within the same colonial boundary, forced to coexist under a single foreign administration. Imagine two families who despise each other being forced to share a house with a stranger as the landlord. That's what happened on a massive scale. The foundations for future civil wars and ethnic conflicts were laid right there in that room in Berlin. France secured a massive swath of West Africa. Britain consolidated its control over Nigeria, the Gold Coast, now Ghana, Egypt, and territories in the south and east. King Leopold's personal claim to the Congo was officially recognized, turning it into his private fiefdom, where he would extract immense wealth through forced labor, resulting in the deaths of millions. Germany, a latecomer to the game, grabbed territories in modern-day Tanzania, Namibia, and Cameroon. Portugal expanded its hold on Angola and Mozambique. By 1914, just 30 years after the conference, over 90% of Africa was under European rule. Only Ethiopia, which successfully repelled an Italian invasion, and Liberia, a state founded by freed American slaves, remained independent. The consequences were devastating and are still felt today. The new colonial borders were not just lines on a map. They became walls. They disrupted traditional economies, which were often based on seasonal migration and cross-regional trade, and replaced them with economies designed solely to extract resources for Europe. Africans were forced to grow cash crops like cotton and cocoa for export instead of food for themselves, leading to famine and dependence. Cultures were suppressed. Languages, spiritual beliefs, and social structures were dismissed as primitive and replaced with European norms. Children were taught in colonial schools that their own history was one of savagery and that salvation lay in emulating their European masters. This was the birth of a deep-seated colonial mentality, a psychological wound that would take generations to heal. The idea that white is right and black is inferior was systematically drilled into the consciousness of the colonized. But what they couldn't divide, what they couldn't erase, was the spirit of Africa. The resistance didn't stop. From the very beginning, Africans fought back. There were armed uprisings, diplomatic protests, and acts of daily defiance. The story of colonialism is not just a story of oppression, it's also a powerful story of resistance. And as the 20th century progressed, that resistance grew into powerful nationalist movements demanding independence. Today, when we look at the political instability, the ethnic conflicts, or the economic challenges in many African nations, we cannot ignore the roots of these problems. The arbitrary borders drawn in Berlin are still a source of tension. The economic systems designed for exploitation are still difficult to dismantle. The psychological scars of colonialism still linger. The Berlin Conference wasn't just a historical event. It was the moment the modern world order was cemented, an order based on racial hierarchy and imperial domination. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame or dwelling in the past. It's about recognizing the truth of how our world was shaped. It's about decolonizing our minds, questioning the narratives we've been taught, and understanding that Africa's story is not one of inherent chaos, but one of resilience in the face of a great historical injustice. The continent is rising, forging a new identity on its own terms, but the shadows of Berlin are long. Thank you for watching. If this history is important to you, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to our channel for more hidden truths. The awakening starts with knowledge.